have a degree in parapsychology from University of California, Berkeley. I would love for you to tell people how many people have a degree in parapsychology. A
Well,
dream started you on the path to being a
if
parapsychologist.
you had known me then, you would have seen a graduate student in criminology doing field work in San Quentin prison with murderers and rapists.
Wow.
And that was my career path when I had what was and remains the most powerful dream of my life. It was a soul to soul connection. And when I awakened from the dream, I was just streaming tears of joy. I
I mean,
thought
what a difference between criminology and now you're going to change course. That's definitely going to be 180 out.
it was. I wanted to go from studying the negative side of human deviance to the positive side of human
Oh
deviance.
God, that's great.
Ultimately, the great mystics all say we are one with everything. And I went into it with the idea that there must be some form of mental illness that causes people to think that they see ghosts. But as I began researching it, I realized that the opposite was true, that the mystics are not mentally ill. They are the most intelligent, wisest people on the planet. The universe wants each of us to become the best version of ourselves. The universe reached out to help me.
And there was a scientist, a professor of I don't know what subject, and they were both looking at me with such disdain and such scorn, and this look that just said, "You are such an idiot for believing these things." And
I've had to face enormous hostility from skeptics in my career. There's a vast amount of evidence, and if you talk to the proponents of what they call the skeptical persuasion, not really true skepticism at all, they would tell you there isn't a shred of evidence, which couldn't be less true. And he said, "What do you want to do with this ability?" And I said to him, "Well, I certainly don't want to do what you do. I'm not interested in controlling the weather or calling down UFOs. That's the era in which we live, a very materialistic era where people think that human beings are fancy machines and that matter is the basis of reality. And if you can't find a mechanistic explanation, material explanation, a physical explanation for something, it doesn't exist."
wow. Oh God, that's great. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Messages of Hope. I feel so blessed to have such interesting guests, and today's is among the most interesting I will have had the chance to interview. Wait till you hear what he has to share with us. He is a psychologist, parapsychologist, and broadcaster. You may have heard of him before because he's been around doing this work for a long time. Jeffrey Mishlove, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Suzanne. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Oh, such a pleasure to interview a master interviewer. That was one of my questions for you, is you have interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people. How often are you interviewed?
Well, over the years, it's been dozens of times, but I've certainly done many more interviews than I've been interviewed.
I'm sure, and we will talk about some of those. But a dream started you on the path to being a parapsychologist. I'd love if you start by talking about that.
Well, there were two dreams, really, and they occurred within a few months of each other back in 1972. When I was a young man, if you had known me then, you would have seen a graduate student in criminology at Berkeley, the University of California, doing field work in San Quentin prison,
Oh my.
in the psychiatric unit, conducting group therapy sessions with murderers and rapists.
Wow.
And that was my career path. I imagined I'd be going into the criminal justice system in some capacity when I had what was and remains the most powerful dream of my life. And it's hard to put it into words. It was so moving. But it was my great uncle Harry who came to me in the dream, and it was a soul to soul connection. And when I awakened from the dream, I was just streaming tears of joy. It was so beautiful, and singing a very sacred song from my religious tradition of Judaism. And so I wrote home. I said, "How's Uncle Harry? I had a dream about him." My mother called me immediately when she got the letter and said, "How did you know Uncle Harry had just died?"
Oh,
And,
here we go. Yeah.
and it turns out that, as best I can figure, he died at the moment that I had this dream. It was pretty much simultaneous. And so I wrote and said, well, it'd be nice if somebody sent me some object that belonged to Uncle Harry so I can remember him by it. They sent me a little book, and I was told this is Uncle Harry's favorite book. It took me a while to figure out what it was because it was written in Yiddish, a
Oh,
very,
gosh.
an obscure language spoken by Eastern European Jews. It's basically a German language written in Hebrew characters.
Wow.
And when I got it translated, I realized it was a book of mysticism. It was the tales of the Baal Shem Tov, who was the
Oh,
founder of the Jewish Hasidic mystical tradition. And it was only then that I realized that in my own family, there had been mystics. And Uncle Harry, who ran a little grocery store, was a mystic. But the Jewish people, my relatives, when I grew up in a small town in the Midwest, they tried to hide that background. They tried so hard to fit in and be thought of as ordinary Americans that they didn't want, this mysticism to be known. And I knew nothing about it until after Uncle Harry died. So that made me decide that I needed to change course after that dream. I knew I had to do something different. And I
mean,
thought
what a difference between criminology and now you're going to, change course. That's definitely going to be 180 out.
it was. I wanted to go from studying the negative side of human deviance to the positive side of human deviance.
Oh, God, that's great.
They didn't have any courses on that at Berkeley, so I anguished about it for months and months. And then I had another dream. And this dream set me on the path that I'm on today because, to begin with, I knew I was going to have an answer to my search in a dream that night. It's like I woke up in the morning with this knowledge that tonight the dream will come, and you've been searching for months to find a way to explore the positive side of human deviance. Tonight you'll have the answer. And so I was primed, you might say. And then I had this dream, which was pretty much a lucid dream. I was visiting friends of mine across town in Berkeley and knocked on the door of their apartment, and there was no answer. And then I found the key to their apartment, let myself in, walked into the living room, and in the middle of the living room floor, I found a magazine named EYE. And I'm paging through the magazine in my dream when I woke up with this feeling of exhilaration, like there's the answer. But I didn't have any idea what it meant. So I acted out the dream. Put on my tennis shoes first thing in the morning, ran 5 miles across town to get to this apartment, knocked on the door, and there was no answer, as I had dreamt. And in fact, I happened to know where they hid the key. So under the doormat, and I took the key, let myself in, walked into the living room, and there, as I had dreamt, in the middle of the living room floor was a magazine. It was called Focus. And it literally brought focus to my life because it was the magazine of listener-sponsored radio and television in the San Francisco Bay Area. And then and there, I decided I could pursue my interest by getting involved in the nonprofit section of the media, which was a huge shift for me because I didn't own a radio or a television back then. And
Wow.
in fact, I didn't believe in them. I believed that electronic communication was phony and I wanted no part of it. But I changed my mind. I went over to the local listener-sponsored radio station in Berkeley, KPFA, Pacifica Radio, and said, I'd like to volunteer. And they said, sure, sit at this desk. And when you hear the doorbell ring, push this button and let people in the front door, which even though I had my master's degree at the time, I gladly accepted that responsibility. And within 3 weeks, I had learned how to produce a radio show.
Wow.
I did my first show. It was called You Don't Have to Be From Out of Town to Be Psychic. And I interviewed just a lot of my local friends in Berkeley who are having psychic experiences. And the program director liked it so much that he said, well, we have a regular slot for you every Tuesday and Thursday at noon called The Mind's Ear. Would you mind hosting? And so within a few weeks of this dream, I'm sitting across a table with 10,000 people listening in, talking to world-class leaders in all the subjects that interested me the most. And,
Wow.
and I've been doing that ever since.
At the time, how did you rationalize the first dream and the second one?
Well, to be honest, I already had a deep interest in mysticism. I never thought of it as a profession or something that.
May I interrupt you for a second? And for those who are new on this path, would you give your definition of mysticism?
Oh, that's a good one because there's so many ways to think about it. And I like to think about it in terms of every definition at once. It could be seeing ghosts, talking to spirits. Ultimately, the great mystics all say, we are one with everything. And that to me is the foundation of mysticism.
Okay. So you already had that foundation. You didn't know Uncle Harry had that foundation.
No, I had no idea about Uncle Harry, but actually as an undergraduate student, I had written a thesis called The Psychology of Religious Mysticism, a senior honors thesis. And I went into it with the idea that there must be some form of mental illness that causes people to think that they see ghosts. And that's what I'll write about. But as I began researching it, I realized that the opposite was true, that the mystics are not mentally ill. They are the most intelligent, wisest people on the planet. And I learned that from reading the work of Abraham Maslow, a great psychologist who studied what he called peak experiences, which are akin to mystical experiences, and how the most successful, accomplished people like Einstein, Eleanor Roosevelt, had these experiences and they were central to who they had become. So I changed my whole attitude by studying the literature. And it was only later, years later, that I actually began having these dreams that led me on the life path that I'm still on.
Okay. So I don't want to make an assumption, but did you determine then that somehow that was the actual consciousness of Uncle Harry visiting you in that first dream?
Well, I had no doubt. It was just so immediate. I couldn't put into words, honestly, what that dream was like. It was so very powerful, but it very clearly was Uncle Harry. We even had, I have to say, if I remember, we had an argument, but the argument was trivial in the light of the power of the spiritual presence that was there. but Uncle Harry was sort of old school with regard to male-female relationships. And I had this idea that men and women are equals. And he was trying to explain to me, no, the man is supposed to, you know. So, and the argument took us into the symbolism of the Chinese yin yang, which has subsequently become my own logo, this little version here, which I call the rainbow yin yang.
I'm looking for mine. I have a logo coin, and one side of it is the yin yang symbol. So yeah. So you knew that was a visit, but then when you had that very clear dream that prophesied what would happen when you took action and ran to that apartment, how did you explain that to yourself? What was the consciousness behind that?
Well, it took me quite a while to really think it through. And what I would say is that when the universe wants each of us to become the best version of ourselves. And when we reach out, when we try to do that, which is what I was endeavoring to do at that time, at the tender age of about 26 or so, the universe reached out to help me.
Beautiful. So it was the universe. Did you ever call it God, or was it consciousness, or has that changed over the years?
Well, I kind of use those words interchangeably, Suzanne.
Okay.
I think of myself as a secular spiritual person. So I like to think that all the different religions are like different languages. And they all have a way of, and science is yet another religion with its own language. And they have a way, each a unique way of getting to the truth. And, you know, in today's cosmopolitan world, it's very useful to be familiar with many languages.
I was a language major, so I get it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the timing of this recording is perfect, Jeffrey, because about 3 mornings ago, I was awakened by our dogs, thank goodness, in the middle of a very disturbing dream. It was disturbing only in that it was so frustrating to me. As a medium, I often don't talk about mediumship with strangers. And when I encounter skeptics who know what I do, I don't deliberately take them on. I let the evidence speak for itself to those who are willing to be open to it. But in this dream, I was at a table in what was like a boardroom, and there was a scientist, a professor of I don't know what subject, and they were both looking at me with such disdain and such scorn, and this look that just said, you are such an idiot for believing these things. And in the dream, I was totally unable to defend myself. And I know that defensiveness comes from the ego side. My soul doesn't need to defend anything. But I would love to know, if you were at that table, what would you have said in response to 2 people looking at you with complete disregard, disbelief, and looking down upon you for the work you do?
Well, what an interesting dream, and what an interesting question.
Yes. Yeah.
And it turns out that I just completed the editing of an interview with a psychologist, Robert Falconer, who's written a fascinating book, and it's called Internal Family Systems, Porous Mind and Spirit Possession. And so in internal family systems, this is a form of psychotherapy that began in the 1980s, sort of after I had completed my education, so only just learning about it. And they believe that we are all made up of many, many parts. And these parts, most people waste so much of their psychological energy because these parts are all fighting each other. And their philosophy is that all of the parts are good. They all have a purpose and a reason for being there. And in a way, just as I tell people is my motto, and what I strive for, not what I have ever attained, is to love everyone and everything all the time. I feel the same way about the parts within me, that even the critics, and I've had to face enormous hostility from skeptics in my
I bet.
career as a parapsychologist. So I know very well what it's like, and they tend to provoke my anger and when they get on their high horse. But I realize ultimately the best thing is to offer them nothing but love.
That's it, isn't it? I have a shirt, love is the answer, and that is the answer. But in the middle of that dream, that answer wasn't coming up. So when I saw that we were talking today, I thought that dream came on purpose, because it's just a great question to ask you. So you wouldn't take them on either, just send them
Well,
love.
I might try to take them on in a loving way. I don't know.
So
Some,
what would you explain to them in a loving way?
well, I suppose it depends on the person, and it depends on the context. And usually it's a good idea to listen first and hear what they have to say, because the way Robert Falconer explained it, and I thought it was brilliant. He said when he deals with suicidal patients in his work, he tries to make friends with that voice. And
That's
so
very interesting. So many of our viewers are intimately familiar with suicide, and have loved ones across the veil who have passed that way. So it's interesting to put that up.
So there are
And
some voices who might say, if you're a medium, it's not always a good thing. Maybe, I mean, everything has its pluses and minuses. There might be an inner voice within you that is saying, this mediumship could be hurting you or detrimental to you in some way. At least that voice thinks so. And so it's often useful, I think, to honor those voices. Doesn't mean you have to go along with them, but you have to recognize that, if you were to take the figures in a dream as each expressing an aspect of yourself, a part of who you are, you would want to honor that part.
well, a lot of people, when they hear about mediumship, react with fear. So let's
Yeah.
go there. Let's go there with the people who are not in a dream, but who encounter that in someone they love, someone in their family gets into mediumship, or meet in a dinner conversation, and they're clearly filled with fear about it. What would your advice be?
Well, it's very interesting, Suzanne. I happen to know that one of your spiritual contacts is William James.
You know that. I
Oh,
read in
yes.
your biography that you teach a class about him.
Yeah.
You've done your due diligence.
Yeah. William James is one of my heroes. And of course, he was a big defender of mediums.
Yes.
And, I found an article he had written in about, I don't know, 1898 in Science magazine, defending the medium. He was working with Mrs. Piper.
Sure.
And the attacks against him were virulent. And he said, he was being sarcastic on the pages of Science magazine. He said that the way these scientists treat mediums, anybody who defends mediums must be insane. And he went on to say, like, any stick is good enough to beat that dog with. That was the phrase he used, attacking his critics, because their arguments were shallow. They couldn't even raise a good argument. And so he got very angry and sarcastic at the mediocrity of the criticisms of mediumship. And I'm afraid that situation hasn't changed a lot today. Any medium, particularly the physical mediums, it's part of the territory. You're going to have people who are just outraged that something like this could be possible, and they take it as a personal offense, and they get angry, and they start throwing sticks and stones in the crudest sort of way.
Well, I'm very grateful that those sticks and stones, for the most part, have not come my way. And perhaps it is because from the beginning, I've known it's all about love. And that's what we try to teach everyone that, don't give anybody anything to push back against. Just give them love, and there's no pushback. So that definitely works. But you're right. I mean, William James was doing this research over a century ago, and people still haven't caught up. So you have a degree in parapsychology from University of California, Berkeley. I would love for you to tell people how many people have a degree in parapsychology.
Well, there are hundreds of people who have done doctoral research and written dissertations on parapsychological topics, but I happen to be, to my knowledge, the only person in the world ever to have a doctoral diploma that says parapsychology right on it. Most of them will say psychology or philosophy or some other field.
And define parapsychology and why it has the word psychology in it.
Well, parapsychology is the study of, you could say it's really what psychology, let's start there. Psychology means the study of the soul. The psyche is the Greek word for the soul. So I think parapsychologists are the true psychologists. They're studying the soul, ultimately, meaning the powers of the soul to reach out beyond the nervous system, beyond the body, to obtain information from distant locations in time and space, or to affect physical systems that are distant in time and space. And then, of course, the question of life after death is part of it. So psychology itself got hijacked by people who think of themselves as behavioral scientists or cognitive scientists. They don't want to even acknowledge that there is such a thing as the soul. And so they dominated the field starting after William James. William James was truly a pioneer in looking at psychology the way we're talking about. But shortly after he died, came along the behaviorists who basically said, if there's one thing we know, William James was wrong. And they took psychology in a completely different direction and dominated the field, so that when J.B. Rhine came along in the 1930s, the behaviorists were dominant, and he's studying ESP, and he thought, well, we'll call this parapsychology, meaning beyond what the behaviorists are doing.
Okay. All right. Well, I like to tell people a little phrase I've been using for over a decade, that someday the paranormal will be perfectly normal. But I have a quote from you that you think it's unlikely in your lifetime there will be academic programs that express parapsychology the way you do. What is the way you do?
Well, and the way I conceived of it back then is that parapsychology is part of a tradition that goes back thousands of years. It's not merely a branch of experimental psychology. It's related to shamanism and yoga and spiritualistic traditions and Buddhism and Taoism and all of those things. It needs to be viewed in this larger context. But I can tell you something else. I was wrong about saying that it's never going to be taught the way I envision it in my lifetime, because I'm currently involved at this very moment in setting up a graduate program in parapsychology at the California Institute of Human Science, so that people can get the kind of degrees that I got, which was an individual interdisciplinary major. That is now going to be possible. And we'll have an official announcement about that probably within 30 days.
Wow, outstanding. So I've read about you wanting to leave a legacy of people really understanding this, and that certainly is one way to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, congratulations. And speaking about other official announcements, it's probably been well more than a year now that the official announcement came out that you had won top prize in a very important contest that was well known by people in this parapsychology field, the BIX contest.
Yeah.
love if you would tell people what the contest was and what your entry was that won.
Yeah, Robert Bigelow in Las Vegas set up the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies, that's BICS. And he offered a large prize for the best essay on the best information or the best evidence for the survival of human consciousness after permanent bodily death. And there were over 200 entries. He gave out prizes to 29 of them, as I recall, totaling about $2 million. And I did win the grand prize for an essay titled Beyond the Brain. And my philosophy in writing the essay is that there are maybe 9 or 10 areas independently that are all pointing towards life after death. Mediumship is obviously one, both physical mediumship and mental mediumship. There's also instrumental transcommunication, people communicating with deceased loved ones via computers and radio and television sets. There's the reincarnation research, there's the near-death research, there's xenoglossy, people who can speak foreign languages that they've never learned, for example. And there's deathbed visions. And so all of these things are all pointing in the same direction, which is to the reality of the human soul surviving the death of the body.
And I read your report when it first came out, and it's no wonder you won. You have just decades of researching. You set out to become an expert, and you clearly are, from your own research and the hundreds of people who you have interviewed, and you put it out there so succinctly, and yet this work and the words in it are still just kept in a little box, aren't they?
Well, it was funny because, the New York Times did a big story about the fact that Robert Bigelow was offering this prize. They called it the largest essay contest ever to examine the deepest question ever. And yet after the winners were announced, the New York Times didn't seem to have any more interest in covering the story.
For them, it was the money.
The big money that was of interest, not so much the data.
The data, right. How can people read that report?
It's available for free. You can download it from the Bigelow Institute website. There's also a Kindle book that's available. The 3 top winning essays are now available on Kindle and on Audible. So for people who want to listen.
Nice. And you've had your own share of writing books. You can zero in on one of them or tell us about all of them.
Well, we've launched a book series through White Crow Books, which is a company in England specializing.
Mike Tim. Is that Mike Tim's company?
Well, he's active in the company.
Okay.
The publisher is John Beecher, and we've launched, our first book came out last year. This is it. Is There Life After Death? And our second book just came out about a day, last week. It was just released, and it contains 15 of my interviews with the great parapsychologist Russell Targ, who is going to be turning 90 next week. So it's a book in honor of Russell. He's one of the people who pioneered the whole field of remote viewing.
What is the title of that book?
Russell Targ, 90 Years of ESP, Remote Viewing, and Timeless Awareness.
Wow. Oh, excellent. I often bring in lessons on remote viewing in my mediumship classes because the same process that one uses for remote viewing can translate beautifully to connecting with those across the veil.
Mm-hmm.
White Crow Books. Wasn't it William James who talked about the White Crow?
It was. He said, if you want to disprove the hypothesis that all crows are black, you only need to find one white crow. And then he went on to say, Mrs. Piper, the medium he was studying, is my white crow.
Oh, beautiful,
Mhm.
beautiful. And then
Yeah.
Dr. Gary Schwartz took that and paraphrased it for my book, Wolf's Message, when he said, if you want to find one spirit who's accurate, Wolf is that one spirit across the veil who left proof of an afterlife. So yeah, I love that. But the connection with William James, I hope that all of you are seeing this web that we talk about in the awakened way of living. We're all connected by one web, and that's consciousness, awareness, the universe, whatever you want to call it. You started out with a public television series called Thinking Aloud, which, as I thought about it, is a beautiful double entendre, right? But
Yeah.
let's really think about these difficult subjects. Let's thinking is allowed, but yours is really thinking aloud. Well, I'm mixing my metaphors here. But now you have a podcast called New Thinking Aloud. Is there a change in focus, or is it new because it's a new program?
Yeah, it's a new iteration of the original Thinking Aloud series. And I had the name came originally from a mentor I had and my co-partner in the original series, Arthur Bloch. We were both students of Arthur M. Young, who was a cosmologist and the inventor of the helicopter, the Bell helicopter, the first commercially licensed helicopter. And he was going to write a book called Thinking Aloud, Allowed. But when he knew that we were starting the TV series back in 1986, he said, "Why don't you take that name?" So we ran with it. It was his gift to us. And
Nice.
then when I established the YouTube channel in 2015, I wanted to just use the same name, but Arthur Bloch was still running the original Thinking Aloud series. So he said, "Why don't you call it New Thinking Aloud?" Which we did.
Okay. Yeah. So you have a book with some of your top interviews in it. Is there any one, or are there two or more that just jump out as the most impactful for you?
Well, everyone I do is the most impactful while I'm doing it. So I've just finished editing the Robert Falconer interview about spirit possession, which I imagine you run into that from time to time as well. Not, every spirit is a positive one. Some of them are unwelcome. And Robert Falconer is doing what I think of as the most sophisticated work that I'm aware of in what used to be called depossession therapy. And so there were therapists all along who knew how to remove unwanted spirit attachments. But he has taken it, I think, to a new level and expressing it in this book. So I was very excited to read about it. One of the points he makes is that if you want to get rid of some spirit that is hounding you for some reason, and it's not part of your own psyche, because we all have many parts inside of us. The key is that every part within you needs to be in an agreement that this unwanted external presence has to go, because you might have some little part in you, let's say a frightened child, who says, "I like that, hoopa hoopa," or whatever it is. That's he's protecting me, or something of that sort. So his point of view is he works therapeutically with people to make sure that all the parts are in agreement that this external presence should leave. And then after it's gone, you also need some therapy to help readjust, because if perhaps you've had this presence inside of you for many years, and the whole system of all the different parts need to reorganize themselves once it's gone. So I think very thoughtful in the way he approaches that. And of course, mainstream psychotherapy doesn't recognize the idea of spirit possession at all, which is a shame, because it has, as you know, both positive and negative aspects to it.
Well, I'm very grateful that I actually don't have experience with it, nor do I know people who have, although I have had students who talk about it and say it's very real. So I, for one, am going to watch that episode and look into his work a bit more. I love that you're talking about it without any fear and just this talking about it as the family systems, which is so interesting because I read that very expression last night in a different book. So clearly it's something I'm meant to pay attention to, but very, very interesting.
Family systems used to be, it still is, a very big form of family therapy where the therapist comes and works with all the family members to, rearrange the relationships. Oftentimes there's a problem with the parents, but in order to heal the parents, a child develops an illness of some sort or a problem, and the parents can focus on that instead of whatever is separating them. But internal family systems therapy takes the view that the whole family system is inside of each of us, not external to us.
Wow, fascinating. Okay, there's another rabbit hole for me to go down. As guided, there's so many ways we could go.
Yeah.
Make a shift here and talk about psychic work. Say that patience is a virtue in psychic work. Would you explain that?
Well, actually, William James made this point with regard to parapsychology or psychical research, as it was then called, not so much psychic work, but the study of it, in which he said, we can't expect progress in this field decade by decade as you have in other disciplines because it reaches so deep. We have to expect progress by the century or the half century instead. So that's one form of patience. As a parapsychologist back in the 1970s, when I entered the field, I thought this is going to be revolutionary. It's going to change everything because it's so significant. And there was so much going on back then. And now, 50 years later, I can say, yeah, it's made a few little changes. We're making progress slowly. Nothing like, back then, my friend Jacques Vallée was involved in the remote viewing research at SRI, and he was also helping to build the internet. And he saw they both could be revolutionary, but we can look back today and say, yes, the internet was. Parapsychology hasn't yet reached its full potential to change society. So that's one way we need to be patient. But I suppose also, as in your dream, there are all these critics who are out there because we live in a very materialistic culture. I just got an interesting story. This book was just sent to me. Mysterious.
Oh, I have that. I have it.
I don't know who sent it to me, but it's signed.
For those who are only listening in the audio podcast, the book is called The ESP Enigma.
Yes, by Diane Hennessy Powell, a medical doctor, a psychiatrist. So I wrote to her, I said, thank you for the book. I guess it must have come from you. It has your signature. And she said, no, she didn't send it. So it's still a mystery. But wow. She told me the story that after she published this book, her colleagues in the psychiatric profession said, if you publish a book like this, you must be insane. That's the era in which we live, a very materialistic era where people think that human beings are fancy machines and that matter is the basis of reality. And if you can't find a mechanistic explanation, material explanation, a physical explanation for something, it doesn't exist. And that's the mainstream view that we're up against right now. And so for anybody entering into psychic work at any level whatsoever, whether you're a researcher or a student or a teacher or a practitioner, you're up against this huge cultural overhang, particularly in the Western world, particularly in the United States.
How are we going to overcome that? Just the patience, just steadily moving forward, or is there a better way?
Well, the evidence is accumulating. We already have 150 years of scientific evidence that of the afterlife, of extrasensory perception. So there's a vast amount of evidence. And if you talk to the proponents of what they call the skeptical persuasion, it's not really true skepticism at all. A true skeptic is first and foremost skeptical of themselves, but these skeptics think they already have all the answers. In any case, they would tell you there isn't a shred of evidence, which couldn't be less true.
Right. Well, just read your report, right?
Yeah.
Your award-winning report. Tell us how people find out more about you and find your programs.
Well, they can go to newthinkingaloud.com. That New Thinking Aloud is all one word, and it's ALLOWED. And that's our YouTube channel, or newthinkingaloud.org is the New Thinking Aloud Foundation. And we publish a weekly newsletter, a quarterly magazine, a book imprint, and we're putting up 4 to 5 videos every week on YouTube.
That's outstanding. For those watching this on YouTube, we'll put the links down below in the description. So why don't we end this with you summarizing your mission, your goal, your individual purpose?
Well, I did a 10-year study with a fellow named Ted Owens and wrote a book about him called The PK Man. He claimed that because of his contact with aliens, he could control the weather, and he did hundreds of demonstrations of large-scale weather control, power blackouts, UFO sightings, hurricanes, tornadoes, heat spells, cold spells, ending droughts. And I took his training program back in 1986 after a very dramatic incident had occurred. And he said, "What do you want to do with this ability?" And I said to him, "Well, I certainly don't want to do what you do. I'm not interested in controlling the weather or calling down UFOs. I said, what I want to do with my life is to become a spokesperson to the mainstream culture about the realities of the esoteric world and psychic functioning." And it was shortly after that we launched the original Thinking Aloud television series. So I would say that whatever magic or power of manifestation I learned from Ted Owens has expressed itself successfully in that vision of letting the mainstream culture know about what people such as yourself know without any doubt in a very real personal way.
What a blessing that is. And it's no wonder you throughout this program, you've had the most beautiful smile on your face, and it's contagious. So I hope that all of you watching and listening will run out and check out Jeffrey's website and his programs and his books and just continue his legacy. Thank you so much for being such a great guest.
Thank you, Suzanne. It's been a pleasure to be with you, and I hope to have you as a guest on New Thinking Aloud.
That would be an honor. I accept right now.
Okay, I'll follow up with you on that.
Right. Everybody, please come back for more of these programs. We'll see you every week and try to continue Jeffrey's legacy as well. Y'all go out and have a great one.